Um, Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Greenberg from the Education Council Consortium. Welcome to our panel discussion on mayoral control and school governance in New York City. I'm first going to ask the interpreters. We have Spanish interpretation tonight on a separate line, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and to explain how to access that interpretation.
Hi, good evening. My name is Maria Sigourney, and I'm here with Megan Morrissey, and we're going to be the interpreters tonight. This is a bilingual space. People may be asking questions in Spanish. So if you're not fully bilingual, including the presenters, I ask you to please access the interpretation tool. At the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that looks like a globe. Press that globe and then choose English. If you cannot see the globe for any reason, then find the three little dots where it says more in your toolbar, and then find the option language interpretation, and then press English and press down to save your preferences. If you have any issues with interpretation, let us know in the chat box. And if you're going to be presenting tonight, please speak clearly and loudly for the interpretation. I'm going to be now repeating these instructions in Spanish. Buenas noches, mi nombre es María Sigourney y estoy acá con Megan Morrissey. Vamos a ser las intérpretes para esta noche y vamos a dar vamos a proveer interpretación al español. Nos encantaría escuchar en el cuadro de comentarios si nos van a estar escuchando y dejarnos saber que cuando empecemos que se escucha bien, que pueden escucharnos bien. Para accesar la herramienta de interpretación, por favor busquen un globo en la parte de abajo donde dice Interpretation y presionen donde dice español. Y si no pueden ver ese globo, busquen los tres puntos en la parte de abajo de su pantalla donde dice More o más, y luego van a ver un menú que dice Language Interpretation o interpretación de idiomas, y luego presionen donde dice español, y por último presionen donde dice Done o finalizar para que se guarden sus preferencias. Si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, déjenos saber en el cuadro de comentarios. Y como les repito, nos encantaría escuchar si van a estar escuchando la interpretación en el cuadro de comentarios también. Y si gustan hablar, por favor, hablen despacio y claro para la interpretación. Gracias. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our interpreters for their work tonight. This is a really valuable and important service that they are providing. Again, I'm Jonathan Greenberg. I'm from the Education Council Consortium, and we are very excited to have this panel discussion tonight on mayoral control and school governance. I'm going to introduce tonight's moderator. Amy Zimmer is Chalkbeat's New York bureau chief. She is an award-winning journalist who previously covered education for the New York News site DNA Info. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Metro newspaper, and City Limits, among other outlets. Her book, Meet Miss Subways, examines one of the nation's first integrated beauty contests. Welcome, Amy. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us on Friday evening, and thank you to the ECC for putting together this roster of really brilliant panelists. My name is Amy Zimmer. I'm the New York bureau chief for Chalkbeat. We are a nonprofit education news site, and we cover schools through a lens of equity. I'm really excited to be here and learn from the deep expertise of our panelists. First, I just want to give a few notes about the format. So first, we are going to start off with a moderated panel discussion before I hand it over to the panelists to ask questions of each other. And then we'll have time for audience questions. You can type questions in the chat at any time throughout the evening, and you'll also be able to ask questions to the panelists directly during the Q&A if you prefer. So before we dive in, I just want to say when I wrote for my Queens High School newspaper, we were required to cover at least one meeting at the Board of Ed at 110 Livingston in Brooklyn. But I don't think I paid a lot of attention to school governance issues until it was then Mayor Rudy Giuliani who famously called for the Board of Ed to be, quote, blown up, right? That was like such a big deal. It made a lot of headlines. And, you know, then his successor, obviously, Mike Bloomberg, became the first mayor in New York to take control of the nation's largest school system and sold 110 Livingston to a luxury condo developer. But of course, 110 Livingston wasn't just a building, right? It represented a system of bureaucracy, which I think, you know, some would say was really broken. And here we are 20 years later, and we're grappling with the governance model that replaced that. And so as mayoral control is set to expire on June 30th, we'll see what happens this go around. How many years? Another 2 years, we'll see. And we'll see what other concessions are made and how the system might change. And so for those of you in this call, in this Zoom, you know, who are pushing for changes, I really hope tonight's discussion can give you a deeper understanding of the issues to help you think about what's possible and what we can learn from the past and the present about community power and decision making and what it all means for school budgets and accountability and for academics and achievement and more. So that is the hope for this discussion. And to start us off, instead of me introducing all of the panelists, I would like them to speak for themselves. And so, you know, I'm going to ask each of them to tell us who they are and how they are invested or connected to this issue of mayoral control. And briefly, I'd like them to discuss, you know, why school governance is important to, let's say, the parent of a second grader who's struggling with reading in Staten Island, or the parent of a math whiz at a under-resourced school in the Bronx. And so, you know, what does it mean for them? What does it mean for their schools and their communities, right? I mean, obviously, people could talk for hours on this, but briefly, I'd like them to talk about those things. So we're going to start, I'll just go in alphabetical order. So David Bloomfield.
Good evening. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Jonathan, and everybody who's taken a Friday night to discuss this exciting issue, one that I've given many years of thought to. So my name is David Bloomfield. I'm a professor of education leadership, law, and policy at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm a former general counsel to the old 110 Livingston Street Board of Education, former education advisor and general counsel to Borough President Ruth Messenger, former president of the Citywide Council on High Schools, and started off my career as an elementary and middle school teacher. So my answer to Amy's question about how those children and families and the community would be served under a changed system is we don't know. I think one of the problems here is not only wondering what the alternatives might be, but also imagining that somehow good education policy follows directly from some change in governance. And I don't think that governance necessarily dictates policy. What I would be worried about for all of those children is perhaps a diminution in the protections if any of those children were children with disabilities, children whose primary language was not English, migrant children, children with home insecurity. And I want to make sure that whatever system might replace mayoral control is one, first of all, that has enough money. And I think mayoral control has focused the mayor, at least, maybe not this year with the budget situation that we're in, but part of that is districts across the country dealing with the fiscal cliff. But a mayor who is disinterested in public education is a mayor who would still control the city treasury, defunding schools in favor of those agencies like police, like fire, like sanitation, that they were held accountable for. So mayoral control, at least I think, focuses the mayor on funding, if not giving better policies for education. So my interest is in figuring out a system that has more democracy, more local input into educational policy making, while at the same time protecting kids and doing good things like universal pre-K, which could only be accomplished under a mayoral control system.
Thank you. Okay, Jonathan Collins, Professor Jonathan Collins.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for teeing us up and to really dovetail off of David, Professor Bloomfield's comments. I'll be pretty brief here. You know, the reason why I think also we should be thinking very openly but yet precisely about school governance as well is just because, you know, I think there are a couple of things. One, that schools are still arguably the most important institutions within our communities. As the nature of community has changed so much over time throughout American history, especially think about over the last century, especially the last half century, what community looks like, urban life, rural life, suburban life. There's been so many changes that have been driven by technology, the way in which we use or reuse urban space. One of the few constants has been the existence of and the persistence of schools physically located in communities. And so with schools being such important places for communities to gather, for communities to interact with one another, especially for our kids, to learn how to interact with people from different households, different cultural backgrounds, different experiences, different lenses. The schools in and of themselves have to be supported in ways that lend themselves to continue to be these beacons of community. And then two, I think the other thing to think about with governance and accountability here is education is really hard. You know, if you're a parent, the one thing that you learn is that, you know, as my 2-year-old screams in the background, I'm sort of living this in real time, that like helping kids develop is very hard. The teacher's job is very hard. And we need processes that can help ensure that kids have the various kinds of supports that they need in order for that development to happen efficiently and effectively and at different paces, and especially at paces and rates that are conducive to the individual child's own growth and development. And so we only do this by having the guardrails that are established by accountability systems. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank
John,
you.
could you also just introduce yourself, like
Yeah.
who you are?
Oh, who am I? Oh, sorry. In addition to being a random person in front of a bookshelf, I am also a professor of political science and education at Teachers College, Columbia University.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Leonie Haimson. You're muted. You're muted.
I can't believe I made that mistake. Yeah. I'm the executive director of Class Size Matters, and I've been involved in the debate over mayoral control almost since it was first instituted in 2002. I've testified a lot and written a lot on the subject and tried to dispute many of the myths that have grown around it. One of the, I think, most pernicious myths is that mayoral control means more accountability. Yet the mayor is elected only once every 4 years, and voters make their choices on many issues in addition to education. When Bloomberg asked what parents should do if they disagreed on how he ran the schools, he said they can boo me at parades. Often mayors go back on campaign promises, and I've had a lot of experience with this. Bloomberg, when he first ran for mayor, promised to lower class size in grades K through 3. And yet by the end of his term, class sizes in these grades had risen to the highest levels in 15 years. 3 different controller audits revealed that DOE during the Bloomberg years had misused state funds meant for class size reduction. During his campaign, de Blasio also promised to lower class sizes, but in all grades, but once elected, reneged on that process. And currently, Adams is resisting compliance with the law passed in 2022 that actually requires him to be lowering class size. And this issue was brought up by many at the recent hearings, both the mayoral control hearings and the budget hearings in Albany. I think we all know that DOE under mayoral control continues to violate many laws regarding special ed services, bilingual services, and student privacy, among others. And I would argue that one pattern pervades pretty much all the districts across the country, which are mostly large urban districts with large numbers of students of color, which is that there's been a rapid expansion of charter schools, which means more and more students are educated with public dollars in systems that are run by private corporations with less accountability. So I would argue that in some ways, mayoral control has led to less accountability because of the growth of privatization, which has often followed the institution of mayoral control. And in fact, Bill Gates and others gave a lot of money for Bloomberg to be able to keep mayoral control, with the argument that it's easier for him to deal with people when there's only one person in charge, because it makes it a lot easier to experiment on school systems and on kids. So that's one of the reasons why I think that the debate is misinformed on a lot of things. But the other major issue is that all our levels of government have checks and balances for good reasons, because decisions made by one person are often very flawed. And in the case of mayoral control, I think that that pertains to our schools as well.
Thanks, Leonie. Now, Heather Lewis.
Hi. Amy, I'd like to answer your question with a brief description of my own journey as a parent. Obviously, it was a long time ago. And why school governance was important to me as a parent of 4 children in New York City public schools in the early 80s. And I just looked at a list of everyone attending this call. There's a few of us here who remember what it was like at the end of the fiscal crisis when the schools were literally crumbling. And my son was struggling in my neighborhood school. And I realized I had to seek help from other parents. I joined the PTA, but I quickly understood that I wasn't the only parent whose child had a problem with a particular teacher. But the worst part was I learned that my son was the lucky one, a lucky one in the school. We discovered that the special education students had been banished to the basement and weren't allowed to interact with the rest of the students in the school. So a large number of us joined together to fight to improve teaching in the school, not just for our own children, but most importantly, to fight for all the children in the school. And we discovered to do that, we needed to reach out to the school board and to the superintendent to expose the unfair and unconscionable conditions for the special ed kids in the building. And I think we all realized that we had power as a group to fight for change, but we really needed external support from more powerful forces. So I ran for school board and then did that for 2 terms and worked as an educator and school reformer, and ultimately studied and wrote about the history of education in New York City schools. But it took me 30 years to fully comprehend what John Dewey said more than 100 years ago. And he said, what the best and wisest parent wants for his child, that must we want for all the children of the community. Anything less is unlovely and left unchecked destroys our democracy. But I think I was finally able to understand Dewey because I learned that what the best and wisest parent wanted above all was good teaching and good instruction. And I had seen over 30 years so many structural and policy reforms happen in New York City schools, including mayoral control. But most of those reforms had not focused deeply enough on instruction. on supporting, improving, and sustaining good teaching. So I learned that it was impossible also to, this was my history hat on, that it was impossible to understand those reforms without paying close attention to the historical context in which they occurred. So what's our current context now? We are moving into a post-neoliberal context in the economy and in schools. In the high point of the neoliberal era, we had, in the late 90s, early aughts, we had, as many people remember, not everyone here, but we had market-driven reforms, data-driven policies such as No Child Left Behind, charter schools, fewer public resources, and parents as consumers. And I think we're all still trying to make sense of where we are now, which probably brought many of us here tonight. And I think it's going to take a lot more of these public deliberations to answer this question, where are we? And it means that there are no simple solutions, and that governance is only one of the things we should be looking at as we move forward. And I'd love to encourage everyone. I had so much to say about accountability, and Jonathan started the ball rolling, and looking at how schools have been held accountable before, during, and now after mayoral control. So I'd love to continue to talk about that.
We will continue talking about that. For now, I'm going to pass it off to Mark Winston Griffith.
Thank you, Amy. Good evening, everyone. Again, Mark Winston Griffith. And I think what's important for you to know about me are basically three identities that I come into this conversation with. One is as a parent, someone who has a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old, both boys who went through the public school system. And so what I know most intimately about the public school system and about mayoral control to some extent is through the filter of my children and trying to do right by them in the system. I also come into this as an organizer and I guess as a social justice advocate. Most recently, I was the founding executive director of an organization called the Brooklyn Movement Center. And it was at the Brooklyn Movement Center where I did quite a bit of parent organizing, specifically in Community School District 16. And that's where I think I encountered a lot of these issues on another level. And then last is as a journalist. I am the co-director of a nonprofit news network called Free Speech TV. But more to the point, I am the co-host and co-producer of a documentary podcast series called School Colors. And the first that looked at race, class, and power in American cities and schools. The first season of which was looking at Central Brooklyn. The second one was in Community School District 28 in Queens. And so, I mean, I'm going to be fairly brief when it comes to trying to answer the question that you've laid before us, Amy. And that is to say, to be quite honest with you, I'm not sure if the average parent in abstract terms needs to know very much about mayoral control. It doesn't mean anything. And I have to say the term mayoral control can be interpreted so many different ways, depending on which jurisdiction it's in and what the government there decides how they're going to interpret it. I think that if you are a parent and if you are a child in the school system, I think the most important thing about mayoral control is that it determines how the bureaucracy is going to impact you and your life. And I think that every parent and every child has a set of needs that they come in with, things that they need the system to respond to them with. And the mayoral control and governance and policy is going to determine how the system responds to you. And so, as someone who, when I came into parent organizing, what I realized the most important thing I can do, and Naquan, who's here, can attest to this, the most important thing you can do for a parent is help them understand what the hell's going on and how they can advocate for their child and how they can exert power on an individual as well as a collective basis. And that means not just training, but just sort of introducing people to different levels of power. I mean, one of the most interesting parts of School Colors, one of the funniest features that we did is when we went through the alphabet soup of school governance, right? And helping people, find their way through that. And even some of the most wizened veterans in the system have a hard time, breaking all of that stuff down. So I would just say that it's important to know that on the individual level, and it's important for people to know that on the collective level, because if they're going to bring any kind of change, they're going to have to know how to impact that bureaucracy. And it's called mayoral control, but there's a lot of space between you and the mayor, and that's what your challenge is to figure out.
Thank you, Mark. So I actually would like folks to put their history hats back on. Heather, I know you mentioned that. So, many of you remember how things used to be under decentralization, or at least have studied it closely. And I actually think a brief history lesson about the good old days, or maybe not so good old days, would provide some helpful context in terms of, what were some things that really did work under the old system, and what were some things that were broken. What lessons are helpful for us to think about as we move forward and think about improving the system? Is there something that you could kind of, just like in terms of like looking back and like, what can we take from that past when we want to like think about what is possible, and what can we learn from that? So I'm going to turn it back to you, Heather, since you were talking about the history hat. So I'll pass it to you first.
Oh, I'll just, there's so much to say, obviously. So just quickly, I'll continue in the vein of instruction. History of instruction under decentralization, right? Before mayoral control. And again, this is decentralization. I think Mark is right. People may not know on this call what the decentralization period was. So I just have briefly say it was a period from 1970 to when Bloomberg came in and the state instituted mayoral control. 2002, is that the right year? So that period of time, and it's important to know that we started down the road towards a decentralized school system, and that definition is also needs to be unpacked, but because of a social movement, because at that period of time, people were fighting for community control of schools during the civil rights era, during the long fight for rights, not only in schools. And so the response of the state and the city after a teacher's strike and resistance to community control was a decentralized school system, which was only really for elementary schools and middle schools, and where school boards were elected in 32, well, there weren't 30, but anyway, 32 school districts. So that era brought in a lot of differences across communities in terms of how that governance structure worked or didn't work in local communities. But and a lot has been said, and people who do remember it talk about corruption and that it didn't work. Of course, Bloomberg really had some choice words for that period of time. He called it a mom and pop operation, right? He called the school districts mom and pop operations. And actually, in looking at some of the districts that did work, District 13 in Central Brooklyn, District 4 in East Harlem, those districts actually, because the superintendents in those districts stayed, number one, and the school boards managed to get past, very important differences, actually, because democracy always brings differences. But to be able to elect those superintendents stayed, And they actually made major instructional reforms in districts that were in terms of student performance or academic performance, the lowest in the city. And so that was over a period of 10, 13 years under decentralization. It's not the story in every district, lots of other terrible stories to tell. But what it demonstrates is that when those kinds of decisions about teaching and learning are at least in part at the local level decided by parents, teachers, and superintendents, that schools can improve, right? But the problem during decentralization is also the Central Board of Education never gave the support that people needed. The resources weren't there. I told you about the fiscal crisis, but also the Central Board did not give the kind of support that schools and parents and school boards needed to run those districts. And they didn't give support for instruction. So they were meant to, the law said they were supposed to, and they didn't do it. So that was despite, the improvement was despite the fact that there was very little support, very few resources, a fiscal crisis. So if you think about all that, and you look at what was accomplished in some places, then you could start to question, well, was it all so bad? And was the extreme, total mayoral control? And I hear David Bloomfield echo in my ears about resources and budgets and things. But was it so? Did we have to go to the extreme? Was it so either or? And is it so either or now? So I'll stop talking. Sorry.
David, do you want to weigh in on any of this? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. I remember those days when I was young and younger. And it's true that decentralization brought some really powerful superintendents to the fore. I mean, we can remember now and take a moment to remember Tony Alvarado in District 4, who brought real change to the East Harlem district. Became a chancellor and was gone in months, I think. And that wasn't really, I think, all his fault. I think that they blamed him for some matters, but I think it was because the power structure couldn't take an innovator like Tony as the chancellor. But I don't know that we can depend on those sort of unicorns that came along to save the system and save 1 million kids. I think it's also a very different system now. It's a highly technological system. It's a highly mobile system. Tony had schools of choice, and he brought in a lot of kids from other districts into District 4. So yeah, I totally believe that we need to have more school-based, not just district-based, but school-based decision-making. I would like to see a benevolent chancellor who saw the necessity for that kind of devolution of authority down to the district and the school level. I'm not sure that the politics allow for that. And so I would like to see more city council involvement, as you know, to bring back some of that local power to the central authority to drive resources, to drive innovation, but also to drive protections to the districts. Remember, at the same time that we can talk about District 13 or District 4, District 14 became an all Hasidic school board, where those members didn't send their kids to the public schools. So I worry about the excesses of community control and low turnout elections. And I think that hurt the community control movement as much as the teacher strikes did, because people didn't turn out and special interests could take over. And so I think we have to put a lot of thought into any alternatives before we jump into a new system. And part of that is the electoral system and how school board members at the local level would be elected, as well as a citywide board.
Can I make a point now?
Sure.
So one of the myths around mayoral control also is that of the tremendous corruption of local school boards that had to be addressed. And actually in 1996, community school district boards had most of their authority over spending and hiring removed from them years before mayoral control. And from then on, the chancellor appointed district superintendents, could remove principals, and controlled nearly all the budgets. So there were very few corruption scandals after that point. And in fact, under Bloomberg and since, we've had some really major multi-million-dollar corruption scandals where, you know, consultants and others have literally stolen millions of dollars of public funds with the collusion of some of the people that worked at the Department of Education. One of the other things that I was reminded of by what David talked about was the importance of driving more decision-making to the school level. And this was one of the things that Chancellor Crew really believed in. And in 1998, he created this green book for school leadership teams, which were supposed to be made up equally of parents and school staff with the authority to devise school-based budgets and comprehensive education plans for each school. And Joel Klein completely tried to eviscerate that, to take away all the powers of school leadership teams to do either CEPs or school budgets. We actually helped launch a complaint to the state commissioner about that, and the power to create comprehensive education plans was put back because that's in state law. But the other thing about the school-based budgets was not in state law. So to this day, they have very limited powers in that regard. And often the powers that they still do have are ignored by principals and by district superintendents and by the city, the DOE as a whole. Carmen Farina tried to make those the meetings of SLTs closed entirely to the public. At one point, she even wanted to close them to parents, other parents who weren't members of the SLTs. And we actually, with Tish James, filed a lawsuit about that and won. But it took several years. But still, school leadership teams are really hampered in being able to take the role that they should in trying to drive some of the decision making at the school level, and that's really unfortunate.
Oh, that's a good point. I'm going to move on to the next question. And I'm going to direct this to Jonathan Collins. So, you know, what would you say are some of the biggest problems with the current school governance system? And then on the flip side, what elements of mayoral control like really work? And so, you know, for example, with the campus shutdown during the pandemic, right? Would a system-wide decision of that magnitude have been possible under a different kind of school governance system?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think the first the primary problem that I think we should zoom out and we have to sort of sit on the table is the notion that, like, just from a research standpoint, there is no evidence that mayoral control is impactful in a positive way. A part of that is small sample size. There are only a few urban districts throughout the country that have been engaging in this mayoral control experiment. It's like places like Detroit, Cleveland, Philly. We had mayoral control in Providence, Rhode Island, where I was previously as a professor at Brown University. And if you look at the cases systematically, again, there's no clear evidence that school districts do better under mayoral control. From an academic standpoint, from a bureaucratic and asset management standpoint, there's no clear evidence there. The argument for it is what you're alluding to, Amy, which is the efficiency through which you can make large-scale decisions. Yeah, when you think about things happening like a pandemic that affects everyone, and suddenly we need to make very big, sweeping changes in very short amounts of time, then having some sort of administrative focal point is quite useful. And the arguments for mayoral control have always centered around this. You know, we've been alluding to it in the conversation leading up to this, or we've been discussing this in the conversation leading up to this, that the whole critique around school governance that kind of jettisoned us towards mayoral control was this idea that these more decentralized forms of governance were hotbeds for bureaucratic mismanagement and misuse. And so having more centralized and more concentrated leadership creates opportunities for a certain level of efficiency, management, and oversight. Whether that actually turns into efficient management and oversight is one in question. You know, I think we just had a conversation about issues in New York City that have shown that that's not always the case, or maybe even isn't even often the case. But then the other thing that we aren't quite so sure about as well is whether or not being able to make swift, wide sweeping decisions is good. You know, in times of crisis, and assuming in times of crisis it can be, and if it's the right decision, it can be. But the same way that we have the ability to make wide sweeping decisions that could be effective in times of crisis, it's also the opportunity to make wide sweeping decisions that could actually be regressive. So this is sort of the tug and pull that we have to be aware of when thinking about mayoral control.
I just want to question, Jonathan, do you think that that's a question of mayoral control or central control? Because obviously you could have a superintendent of schools appointed in some way, shape, or form with the same kind of central ability to, say, shut down the system during a pandemic or a snow day.
You know, that's true. It could be through a more centralized form of governance that doesn't necessarily require the mayor being in control. I think also what mayoral control gives you, in addition to centralized authority, is the ability to coordinate across different local government agencies. You know, this is theoretically your best chance at ensuring wraparound services for schools, coordination between all the different city service agencies that operate under the mayor's administrative purview could then be more easily steered towards schools and providing those additional supports, again, theoretically.
Jonathan, can I ask a question, Amy, of Jonathan as well?
Go for it.
You were mentioning studies done of mayoral control in other cities. I'm curious, what were the findings there? Were there any examples of mayoral control that you would deem successful by any measure? And if so, what do you think was the contributing factor in those instances of them being successful?
Well, it depends on the way in which you view success or what parameters you're looking for when evaluating or indicating success.
Well,
I think
the same parameters you used when you were applying it to New York, I guess.
Oh, well, so the parameter that I was thinking about was achievement scores. And it's a very sort of reductive parameter, but it gives us kind of a starting point to think about, to help to begin to think about like student learning. And I think an interestingly positive case of gains in student achievement as a result of mayoral control is actually Newark. Everything else was a disaster. But you did see under Cory Booker's stint as mayor, this combined with the large grant that was conveyed by I think Mark Zuckerberg gave like over $400 million or something to the district as well, if I'm remembering the case correctly. But they saw pretty sizable gains in achievement as a result of this stint in mayoral control. It's also complicated by the fact that they also there was also a major expansion of charter schools within the district. And it's not clear from the analysis how much the charter school enrollment is actually kind of biasing the results in a negative, in an overly positive way. But Newark is one case you can point to that, at least on the surface, seems to have shown some gains of academic achievement under mayoral control. That's the main one I think you could point to if you wanted to sort of fly that flag.
Thank you.
I actually have a question, sort of, you know, Detroit, LA, Oakland, they all moved away from mayoral control. So I'm curious if we know anything about how they fared after. I don't know if we have enough time or evidence, but like, you know, what are there any notable results that are helpful to think about since they moved away from mayoral control?
So that's a more challenging question to answer, just because most of the studies of mayoral control were happening around the period where they started to make the switch. So we don't have the best updated metrics on, or at least there hasn't been a comprehensive study that looks at districts that change from, those urban districts that have changed from mayoral control back to the more standard board control. I mean, I could do some digging, and if you invite me back for a follow-up conversation, I would be happy to sort of lay out what I can find.
I will take you up on that.
There's a very recent example, an elected school board in LA, having moved away from mayoral control, has just banned co-locations of charter schools in that district schools. So
LA never had mayoral control.
Excuse me?
LA never had mayoral control, but
they have just, an elected school board has eliminated.
They've always had an elected school board. They closed the schools much quicker in LA and San Francisco, both with elected school boards, with many fewer people having died during COVID before de Blasio, who really delayed very, very long in a very indecisive way, of course, for a week or so. And I think I put in the chat that Tom Frieden said that if schools had been closed sooner and New York City had adopted safety measures a week or two earlier, the death rate could have been reduced by 50 to 80%. There was a letter signed by over 20 epidemiologists who begged de Blasio to close the schools, and he dragged his feet on it. So I don't think that's a particularly good example at all. LA in many ways fared better during COVID. So not only did they close the schools quicker, when they reopened them, they had many, many more very fundamental health safety measures, including widespread testing of kids for COVID in a much, much more effective way than in New York City. And then in terms of the learning loss, they were like the one district that apparently did not lose much learning at all during the pandemic, and I think they even improved in some ways. So I really think that the efficiency of a school under mayoral control really depends on who the mayor is. And de Blasio was incredibly indecisive. He did a lot of things that made no sense. For example, his own integration or school diversity task force recommended that he get rid of the gifted and talented classes. And I think he spent a year and a half mulling it over and finally decided to do it a couple months before the end of his term, when it was very easy for Eric Adams to come in and completely reverse it. So I really don't think that efficiency is necessarily a quality or a benefit of mayoral control. It depends who the mayor is, you know?
And it is interesting to see how each mayor tries to undo what their predecessors have done. Heather, I see you raising your hand.
Well, I don't know if you're going to take us somewhere else. That's why I'm raising my hand, because I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, well, what would replace mayoral? You know, what do we think could replace or alter, or what could alter the balance of power, or could we move on? I mean, David started to talk about that.
I'd love to hear that. I was gonna, I mean, I was going to ask about the panel for educational policy and, you know, kind of get at like, how does that differ than an elected school board, right? And then how might those differences play out on the ground in schools and in districts? I think it might be helpful to think about that. And so I don't know Heather, I don't know if you want to start with that now. Does anyone want to talk about the PEP and how?
I mean,
Yeah.
I want to talk about the nature of elected school boards and the difficulty of that. And I just want to raise the legal questions that I don't think have been raised sufficiently elsewhere. What would an elected school board look like? I mean, a lot of people say we should change for people who are on the Zoom who don't know about the PEP. The PEP is our school board. It's a totally appointed board. There are parent representatives, there are borough president representatives, and the majority are mayor representatives. I'm not sure that even meets the real legal requirement of one person, one vote in terms of school district control. If we had an elected school board, you certainly couldn't go back to the old Board of Estimate model that the US Supreme Court, in terms of New York City school governance, said violated one person, one vote, where Staten Island had one representative and Brooklyn had one representative. We would have to redistrict and have school board elections perhaps at the community level and at the citywide level that were representative of the population. And I think that's a very difficult proposition to institute, but it would be an interesting idea to have an elected school board that was committed only to educational issues, still likely an unpaid school board, part-time school board, and what would that look like? So I would like to just open up the questioning in the spirit of Jonathan had this great quote in a TC interview where he said, you know, the reason that the politics of education is so interesting is because we have to be creative and almost artistic in thinking about that. But I think we also have to, I admire that, and I also think we have to be legalistic into how we would put Humpty Dumpty back together again into a truly representative and community respecting system.
So personally, I would not be for an elected school board that was part-time without pay. We are the largest school system in the country. If we're going to have an elected school board, it should be a full-time job with pay and staff. That's the way LA does it. That's the way most large school boards do it. Otherwise, you're making it sort of, you know, either only for rich people who can afford to do this as a part-time, you know, gesture or whatever, and without the support that they really need. So I think if you're going to have an elected school board, you need an elected school board that really treats it as a full-time job. You get paid and you get staff. And given the entire budget of the DOE, which I think is like $35 billion, I think we could afford to do that, right? Definitely the PEP as it exists now is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment to the city of New York. It is really sad the way the mayoral appointees automatically vote for every single contract, no matter how bad it is, no matter how corrupt it is, no matter how dumb the policies, often without saying a single word of justification for their votes. So the independent PEP members go on very eloquently. The student member goes on incredibly eloquently about why a certain proposal is wrong. And then the mayor appointees just automatically all vote yes, like something out of the Politburo. And I think it's just really a shame for this city how bad the PEP is and how depressing it has been over the years to attend so many PEP meetings where there have been hundreds, if not thousands of people who've come out to beg PEP members to keep their schools alive, not to close them. Students who've said, look, I've been kicked out of 2 other schools. If you close my school, I am going to drop out, and have absolutely blank faces on the mayoral appointees and the DOE officials on that stage. It's really so disheartening. I mean, I can barely stand to go to PEP meetings anymore because I find it so incredibly depressing, and it is demoralizing, and it is really, I think, a stain on the city of New York, how bad that system is. So whatever changes, it's got, and I do support an elected school board because I think that democracy is the best chance we have. Of course, it's not a perfect system. They're not going to make great decisions all the time, but I do think the mayor needs to have a stake in it. So I'm not sure, whether the mayor should continue to have some appointees on an elected school board. I think that's what the mayor of Boston wants, some appointees and have the rest elected. They're moving towards an elected school board in Chicago, but there may be a transition where the mayor still has some appointees. The one thing I am worried about, though I don't think it's the most important thing, is the original reason that people who really were intelligent and caring supported mayoral control, which was the budgetary issues, that they had seen Giuliani undercut the Board of Ed so many times and really underfund our schools in a very drastic way. But of course, we've had mayors that have cut the budget for schools drastically since, including Mayor Adams, when we have, a 3-point-something billion surplus. So I don't think that should be the main reason to keep mayoral control, but I do think that there has to be some consideration to giving the mayor a real stake and a real say as well in what happens, just in terms of funding.
And so I want to talk a little bit though about representation and participation. Mark, I'll see if you want to answer this one. But like, how do we make the system more democratic, whether it's under mayoral control or not, right? So if there is an elected board, how do you get voter participation? Are there worries about like who might gain power in that scenario?
Well, that's what you get with democracy, right? I mean, once you, and it gets to the whole question of control. Once you talk about democracy, then yes, you are giving up, relinquishing a certain level of control. Back to the question that you asked earlier about decentralization and how it compares to now. I mean, I don't want to like harken back to the good old days, but one of the things that decentralization sort of facilitated, or at least was sort of kind of can be laid over, was this idea of community empowerment and people working at a local level, having some kind of sovereignty or dominion over their neighborhoods. And look, let's be honest, some of it was corrupt, just like we've heard that their mayoral control could be corrupt as well. But at the end of the day, it facilitated people's involvement in their neighborhood. And I don't know what the vote totals look like as far as the CEC and the school boards back then, but I do know that people saw those as an opportunity to like get out the vote and work hard to include people in the governance of that school board. Now, it also led to people using the school boards as platforms for issues for raw power. Sometimes it had nothing to do with education, and you had people who really, just had very little interest in school governance at all, and were just using it as a platform for something else. So, I don't think it's a matter of whether you have democracy or not. I mean, obviously, you have to have democracy, and I think that you can put in checks and balances and safeguards that can mitigate against the biggest corrupting forces, but people, whether it's a community activist or it's a parent, want to feel that they have some power over their school system, and how their children are educated, and democracy is really the only way to it.
Yeah, Heather.
Well, David, you might remember this would have been the 80s, maybe late 80s. Thomas Sobel, our Commissioner of Education at the time, proposed, and it's kind of getting to what you're saying, both you and Mark and David are saying. He proposed that the city council districts and the school boards and the community boards, so all of the decisions about neighborhoods, right? Not just schools, but all of the services, all of those democratic decisions that should be made close to the neighborhoods are contained within the within the same voting lines. So he proposed, and it was a wild proposal, nobody could even imagine, but make the city council districts, the school districts, contiguous, change the lines, and then you have a lot of voters too. You have more turnout because you're turning out for city council elections, for school board, and for other community boards. Don't do much these days, but they do make some zoning decisions. So all those decisions are within a certain radius. And sounds pretty wild, but when you think about it, it could accomplish a lot of things.
Well, if you held the elections at the same time, even if they weren't co-term, the same borders, the same areas, that brings out a lot more voters. And so obviously, if you have the elections where there are no other elections being made, school boards tend to have very low turnout. But if you did it during presidential, congressional, legislative elections, which come every 2 years, legislative elections, you get a better turnout. I don't think it's that complicated a problem, really.
I didn't have Tom Sobel on my bingo card, but if we talk about Tom Sobel and Tony Alvarado in the same conversation, I think we're on to something.
I'm just gonna ask one more question before we open it up to the panelists asking each other questions. But it's been interesting to hear Mayor Eric Adams and the school's chancellor David Banks advocating for retaining mayoral control, which they're calling it mayoral accountability, right? And so that came up, and I'm curious to hear what you think about the way they want to rebrand it, but also like, what does accountability mean to you in the context of school governance? So I'd love to hear that, and then you can ask each other questions. So who wants to take on that question first? What does accountability mean to you in this context of school governance? Yeah, Heather, go ahead.
I am going to bring up something that seems a little distant from what we think of as typical accountability, but this occurred started under Crew. It was even under Bloomberg for a certain amount of time. That we had, I don't know if people remember this, but school quality reviews. And what we've been talking about when we're looking at the effectiveness of mayoral control across the country is, as Jonathan said, we're looking at proxy test scores, really. I mean, it's really a limited accountability or research measure. The school quality reviews, which when they were funded and really systematized, brought people into schools from externally, educators, but also community people, parents, to really look at what's going on in the school. And to, and this was developed in England, the process, it's no longer happening either, but, and then to Bloomberg's credit, it was really systematized in the sense that it was all made public thanks to technology. So we could all read the school quality reviews online. And those reviews really, really looked at what was going on in the school, what the teaching was going on, it was beyond, obviously, much more than test score results. And it was an accountability measure too, because it's public, but it's based on real, tangible, deep instructional and deep looking at what's going on in the school. So, I mean, much more so than inside schools, looking superficially in a way. This was a deep look. And I'm not sure you would call that accountability. I would call it public accountability because it was really, because the measures that were being used and the way that people were looking was truly significant and representative of what's going on in the school.
As long as we don't go back to the letter grades.
I was just gonna say, but there were also the letter grades, right? The A through F letter grades, and so
But fun fact,
we don't need letter grades.
Fun fact: I studied in Cardiff, Wales, in the '70s. Studied education, and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of the Schools sounds a little like mayoral control. The Inspectorate of Schools. It was a great system, and I agree that we need something like that. And we also have to send them into the private schools too, to make sure they're checking to make sure that they meet secular education requirements. It's another issue.
I'll just say when I hear the term accountability, my mind immediately goes to Bloomberg and sort of the paternalistic approach he took to governance and mayoral control. That is, there's no coincidence that he was the one who helped usher this in, because he pretty much figured that he was not just the smartest person in the room, the smartest person in the city, and that he was like the big daddy that we sort of, and that we didn't know better ourselves, and that he knew better than all of us. And it's no mistake that it's no surprise that he used that term mom and pop, because he looked at us in such a condescending way and had this corporate lens on everything. And when we talk about, I think what he helped introduce, it's important to recognize the importance of standards, right? That we do have to maintain some level of standard. But to the point that Professor Collins was making before, how are you measuring success? And what it has come down in many instances to is test scores. To what Heather was saying before, there's no real true understanding, and there's not enough of a qualitative understanding of what success means for different people in different communities.
I think one of the most dangerous things that Bloomberg introduced, which is still with us today, is this notion of treating schools like a marketplace, and that the best schools would get all these parents to want to send their kids to, and the bad schools would shrink in size and they would be closed, and they would either have new schools or charter schools put in their place. And this administration is still very rooted to that concept, which never worked under Bloomberg and doesn't work today. And so part of the debate over, whether we have space for lowering class size or whatever else, is that we have very underutilized schools sitting right by very overcrowded schools. And the overcrowded schools, as Weisberg said, have a brand associated with them that is mostly based on test scores. So parents want to send their kids there, and the schools with the low test scores suffer and shrink and have smaller and smaller budgets, because the budgets are tied to enrollment. And it's really a system that serves nobody well, especially at a time when we're not closing schools anymore. So these schools keep on shrinking and shrinking in size, and it's very segregated, because most of the quote unquote empowered parents who are white and Asian flock to these overcrowded schools. And most of the underutilized schools, which are very small, are mostly Black and Hispanic and poor. And we're not looking after what the system is as a whole and how to make all schools good. Simply this notion of competitive marketplace is going to drive better, success. And it's a false notion. And unfortunately, we're still stuck in it.
And, it's ironic because mayoral control, when you hear mayoral control, you think of it as an opportunity to build a common good and to bring people together, to unify people. And Bloomberg did anything else, he splintered us. He pit us against one another and, just established this sort of law of the jungle, and the fittest survive. And it's, it still persists in the system today.
Yeah, I think a really good case can be made that it's not mayoral control necessarily that's the problem, but it's what Bloomberg did to set the model for what mayoral control would be, and the other two subsequent mayors have followed in that kind of overarching system. If you look at the dynamics of mayoral control, the mayor's control, besides collective bargaining and finance, which probably would stay if we change the system, but the mayor appoints the chancellor and a majority of the PEP. The mayor could then walk away and say, you guys run the system. What do I know about education? But of course, that's not the Bloomberg way. And we're stuck with the Bloomberg way. We need a shock to the system, I think, to reset some kind of centralized authority that's respectful of the field and isn't the kind of paternalistic control freak that Mike Bloomberg probably would admit to being. At the same time, he did give more power to principals. I think that the people who worked during that era feel there's less power for principals now than there was during the early 2000s.
I don't know whether they think that or not. I mean, there's this whole debate over whether principals should be able to do whatever they want with their budgets and, not have to follow the directives of law or necessarily, what the central systems want. So it's still a very principle-oriented system. And you're given a budget and you're supposed to go out there and somehow succeed, no matter what your student body is. So the saddest thing is to see all these principals of these very small, underfunded, underutilized schools literally have to go advertise their schools in neighborhoods and put up posters and whatever to compete with charter schools, and which have much more budget for marketing and for other public schools, and spend so much time and effort trying to recruit students when there's an overflow of students in at other schools based upon nothing but their quote unquote brand and test scores. So it really is it's not a great system for principals either, I don't think, in terms of, their ability to really run their schools in a rational way.
I also just have a question. Just, this city's school system is so huge, right? 1,600 schools, 900,000 or so kids. Just broadly, is like the system size, does it make it fundamentally difficult to govern just something so vast, right? I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that. It's just so gigantic.
Well, that's why it makes comparisons also so hard. We're more than twice the size of LA. And so the size and diversity of the system is a huge factor.
It's a very, very tough system to run, for sure. It's so huge and so much variety and so much diversity and so many issues. It's not an easy school system by any means.
Can I jump in with something really quickly about Bloomberg that also complicates the narrative? I mean, everything that has been said is true. And the thing that complicates the conversation is that, well, when you look at the reductive and biased measure that it is, which is student achievement scores, you do see pretty substantial growth happening sort of during and immediately after the Bloomberg administration era. You do. That's what the data says. I don't make up the numbers. I'm just here to tell you what
Not
the
on
numbers
NAEPS.
show. Show me the NAEPS. And I'm not here flying the flag. I'm just making sure that we have a well-rounded conversation here. And I'm also here to make sure that we understand that, like, this is the like, we have to sort of confront the primary challenge that sits at the core here, which is, like, if there is evidence that New York City has been doing better under mayoral control, then the primary evidence can't be test scores. We have to, kind of to Mark's point, be more accurate and precise about the measures beyond test scores that matter much more. If it's diversity in schools and the diffuse enrollment of schools, if it's just like parent and teacher satisfaction, if it's civics literacy skills, like I just think one way to also complicate or push back against the persistence of mayoral control is to continue to point clearly to the things that mayoral control hasn't done well, because the sort of flag bearers of mayoral control are pretty much just looking to the test scores and they're saying, yeah, but like, look at this. So just wanted to put that on the table too.
I'm here for complicating the narrative. That's all I'll say.
Mark, go ahead.
I'm sorry, David. I was just saying I'm here for complicating the narrative. That's all.
Yeah, you know, I was on the high school council at the time of all the school closures and the establishment of the small schools. I sued the Bloomberg administration over keeping kids with disabilities out of small schools. But like Amy Schwartz at NYU has actually demonstrated a fair degree of improvement with the small schools over the large schools that Bloomberg closed. So I think it's one of those examples. It may be a mixed record. I think we lost kind of a generation of kids who had their schools pulled out from under them while these small schools were established. But I think nowadays people would see that as a success. So it's one of these situations again where I think large-scale change is possible under mayoral control when it might not be possible otherwise. Heather?
I just wanted to say that, you know, this is just about the test score conversation and what's happening at the state level right now. Just, you know, as some people may know, you know, there's been a task force on looking at other ways of assessing and other forms of assessment and at the state level. So that's beyond the city. And it is true that we need the state in that conversation as well. It's not just a city conversation. And that there is there is research. There is a task force. There is, you know, there are precedents. There are schools that have been doing things differently. And so I think we are in a different era, and there are new ways to think about this, and that we shouldn't be limited by thinking about test scores as the only way of thinking about progress or effectiveness, and the only way of holding schools or mayors accountable.
The thing about Bloomberg too is that it's also an unfair assessment of mayoral control, just because he was rich. And he put a lot of his own money and resources and from his network into schooling as well, that also kind of inflate the impact of mayoral control. This kind of goes back to the point of why things look very differently under de Blasio. And not to say, this is not to say that things were rosy under Bloomberg, quite the opposite, but this is to say that Bloomberg was able to put together the optics and the metrics of success. And I think a lot of that was because of the ability to use wealth and resources to sort of wrap arms around a school reform project in a way that most cities and most mayors just cannot.
Do you have other questions for each other for this segment of the event?
I'd love to hear from the audience.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. I can I can start asking them. So people have written in, but we can also, I'll do a mix of, I'll read a question and then we can turn to the audience. So, or actually, you know what? Let's just turn to the audience first. Let's have the audience ask the question first. Remember to make sure that it is a question and keep it brief. So first person.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Hollaby. Thank you very much for the panel. Tough question, I think. The quote, thank you, Heather, from the beginning, what the best and wisest parent wants for his child, that must we want for all the children of the community. Before community control, Black and white children went to very different schools and had different educational experiences from each other. Under community control, even though there were some advancements and gains, those experiences were still different. That the parent wants for his child, we weren't getting it for anybody else's child. If anything, it's gotten worse under mayoral control, not better. I'm not going to argue about that. But my question for the panelists is there a system, a school system, where we can start envisioning one vision for all of our children of New York? Or are we just accepting that this is how we are, how we've been, and how we're going to be?
Who would like to take that?
Well, yeah, I'll just jump in. You know, we can't accept the highly segregated state of the New York City public schools that horribly delayed and, as Leonie described, kind of I don't know, political football that Bloomberg that de Blasio turned diversity into. That second report that the commission came out with was, I think, an excellent report about a good way to have more diversity in our public schools. We have the selective high school issue, which I think is a bad one, but it's state controlled. The state has decided that we would have the specialized high schools. It's something that Adams.
The state controls 3.
Well, I know, I've written a lot about it.
And we have many, many more that were created by Bloomberg and de Blasio didn't stop it.
Right, so they haven't stopped it. And I think we need to reintegrate schools based on academics as well as race. And those are steps that, again, I think would need an enlightened mayor or central authority to make happen, because the districts are themselves so highly segregated, with notable exceptions.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, I'm just going to read a question. So what impact, if any, a decentralized approach to managing the school system may have on existing inequities across school districts? That is, I don't know if anyone wants to take that, but a decentralized approach to managing the school system, what impact might it have on existing inequities across school districts?
Well, you know, District 15 did amazing thing with trying to get rid of screens for their middle schools and managed to more adequately integrate their middle schools because of this. And one of the reasons they did it is that there was such a competitive, competitive system to get into the right middle school that all parents really didn't like the system. But other districts have been very resistant to doing the same thing. So it's not clear to me that necessarily by decentralizing, you're going to get more integration within districts, because it really depends upon the politics and the makeup of the leaders in a specific district. And it's a very difficult issue. So District 2 hasn't managed to do it in the same way. And I think, Jonathan, Mark, you did a show on District 28, wasn't it?
Yes, we did.
Where the politics are very difficult. So it's not an easy nut to crack, even with local control.
Okay, next
I
question.
thought Professor Collins was gonna, I saw him come off mute.
Next question from the audience.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. And thank you for Amy. Thank you for moderating this, and the panelists. Amazing. I'm excited to be spending my Friday night with you all. One of the biggest things for me is like the biggest elephant in the room around this conversation is really about race, and how, you know, I find it deeply infuriating that the districts that have mayoral control, by no stretch of the imagination, are districts that are majority of color. And I find it incredibly offensive that the narrative is always how corrupt those districts were, where, you know, I think we all in New York City understand, like, there has been some major politicians and done some really serious corruption, yet we all don't scream that, you know, mayors and assembly people and senates should all be abolished and we should all start from scratch. And one person should just have all the control. So I'm wondering, you know, I know this is for me, this is like the center of the onion in this conversation. How does everyone sort of, with all the politics that surround that, and we want to empower families, but when we first say it was all corrupt, it eludes that we can't trust people of color. So how do we grapple with that?
I think I spoke about this towards the beginning of the session, where I pointed out that the corruption during the Bloomberg years was much, much greater in terms of the amount of money that was lost, millions and millions of dollars of corrupt contracts. And there were also large corruption during the de Blasio years. I think the guy in charge of food was getting money for, you know, for chicken nuggets that had bones in them, and you know, has been indicted and convicted. So I think that there is a tremendous disservice given to that narrative. And also, as I also pointed out, the community school boards had their power to hire and fire, and most of their funding decisions taken away from them, I think 8 years before mayoral control was instituted. So there is a lot of, I think, problematic rhetoric that goes along with that, that myth that somehow the community school boards were more corrupt than mayoral control. It's simply not the case at all.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important questions here, because it taps into a national conversation. And because, you know, Naomi is 100% right here. If you look at the list of schools, I mean, the list of districts, of cities where mayoral control has been enacted, they're almost uniformly schools that have large, if not majority, people of color populations within those cities. And so regardless of what the sort of material politics look like on the ground before we even get there, there's something that's happening that to where like the political message around schools and school governance is that when there are people of color there, we cannot trust more locally accountable leadership to be empowered to be in place here. And so, you know, one of the things that we also should be thinking about when it comes to school governance in urban cities is process and empowerment, and really like more thoughtful and strategic ways to surface community voice, especially community voice in the communities of color in particular. So, you know, because every mechanism that we've been relying on thus far is racially biased. So the literature shows us that there are racial imbalances in voter turnout, in school board elections, and every election, every sort of type of election from top to bottom. But in school board elections and city council elections, white voters are more likely to take up a larger percentage of the electorate or be overrepresented in the electorate. When you look at participation at board meetings, white middle class and wealthy residents are more likely to participate in these kinds of meetings and forums. So every avenue right now that we have for student voice to be expressed is biased towards those who are white and wealthy. So we need to be thinking about processes that operate more on the terms of Black and brown folks and folks in low-income communities, regardless of kind of what the centralized structure looks like. And so, and that's not just a New York problem. That's a national major US city urban politics problem.
Can I just answer, just also, this is not just the political end of it, but when I interviewed superintendents during decentralization in the era when everyone said the school boards and the districts were corrupt, the superintendents who were, and school boards that were working, said that nobody came to see what they were doing. Nobody did any research from the central administration to try to understand why they were working and what they were doing. So that's the other piece of it, is the research isn't happening. Nobody's looking. And I think that that's, you know, there's the political part, but there's also the story part of it and what's actually going on and who's telling the story.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, one of the things that we looked at with the school colors, we went back, you know, sometimes 150, 100, 200 years, looking at race in the city, you know, against education. And that was always the narrative. It was always a narrative that when you put Black people in charge of, whether it's a principal, whether it's people governing a school district and on a school board, whether it's Black parents, Black and brown parents, they just don't know how to govern themselves. It's not just corruption, it's an ineptness and this idea that they're self-serving and don't know what they're doing. So that's always been the narrative, and there's always been this scarcity narrative also that has operated within Black and brown neighborhoods, and this sense that, you know, there are not enough resources and you have to do whatever is necessary to get those resources as well. So it's a very pernicious and poisonous narrative that, you know, it's a part of what racism, it's part of the corrupting influence of racism. And again, no matter whether you're talking about mayoral control or pre-mayoral control, it persists.
Okay, next question. Naquan, I saw you were next, and then I think you fell out of the Zoom, but so next audience question to Naquan.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for doing this. I see some folks that I really admire. I have so many questions, but I'll just say this one. What is your thoughts on this administration and superintendent's autonomy and how superintendents are being held accountable or not being held accountable? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Can I just say something that I wish Naquan was on the panel, and I'd love, I invite, yes, anyone can answer that question, obviously, but I would love to hear what you have to say about that, Naquan.
That's how I met Naquan, asking him that very question.
So go for it, David.
No, I want to hear from Naquan. But I know Amy said no speeches, but Naquan, you can make a speech.
No, I really want to hear your thoughts on this. I have my thoughts. I'll be honest, and Mark is laughing because we've been through, I've been on the council for 10 years and we've been through 4 superintendents. We're on our 4th superintendent. So would love to hear, and I know me and David had this conversation and that's why I'm bringing it up. Like, would love to hear your thoughts on under this administration. So we went from an administration under Bloomberg where they had no power, right? There was no power. But would love to hear your thoughts on this current administration and the power that they gave.
Looks like Heather? No? Okay.
I mean, there is a mandated curriculum again, so we're back to that. So I guess to the extent that superintendents are being told what curriculum they have to use, that's somewhat disempowering. We went through a stage with Bloomberg where there was a mandated curriculum, and then they decided it was not a good mandated curriculum, and then they gave it principal autonomy. So that goes through waves. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much autonomy superintendents have under this administration, but to the extent that they're told what reading program they're supposed to use, and I think the math program also at certain levels, that's less autonomous.
Well, I think one of the biggest mistakes that this administration has made was they kind of cleaned house of the old superintendents and pretty much installed the people who they wanted so that they would be pliant, and then established this kind of crazy hot seat situation that was supposed to be modeled on the CompStat system that the police department uses for supervising superintendents. So I think that under the Adams administration, I think we've seen even kind of more of a top-down system than we've seen under other mayors. They need to really trust the educators, and that's superintendents who trust principals, and principals who trust parents and teachers and staff. And I think that yeast has been boiled out of the system. And I think that we need superintendents who will be partners with their CECs, and not disregard their CECs because they're kind of always looking above for orders rather than from the community.
Does anyone else want to take that, or I'll move to the next question? Okay. We'll go to another audience question. Who's next?
I'm trying to ask, I think it was Brenda Irizarry. I'm trying to ask you to unmute. Oh, there you go.
Okay, thank you. All right, good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for taking the time to do the meeting. I think it's very important. And I do like reading Chalkbeat. I learn a lot about that. I'm a retired teacher from the New York City public school system, School District 10. My question is, how can communities organize to push for reforms with mayoral control?
That's a good question. Who wants it? Heather?
I was, Brenda, could you just say a little bit more about, yeah, just a little bit more.
Well, there's so much going on with mayoral control, and it is an important issue because it affects almost 1 million students, correct? And I think one way to bring reform is through organizing with different organizations, and of course parents, because without the parents, then you don't get the progress that you need or the power that you need to make change. So that's what I'm at. My question is about.
Brenda, I don't know whether you participated or you watched any of the borough hearings that the state education department held, but they were really quite terrific, I thought. Some of the best hearings I've ever seen, actually, with hundreds of parents and teachers coming out and speaking very passionately and very intelligently about the issue and how they felt. There's supposed to be a report that's going to be put out by the state education department at the end of March, I think March 31st, which is supposed to look at the what the record of mayoral control is, but also supposed to report on what was said at those hearings, which were overwhelmingly, I think, negative on mayoral control. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens after that report comes out. Most of the legislators say they are not going to wrap it up in the budget, but they want to make their decision about whether to renew it or change it or let it lapse at some point after the budget is decided. And I think at that point, it really behooves parents to reach out to their legislators who are going to be making the decisions about this. And I assume that some groups will have some organized efforts to do that as well. But I think, as someone who's been participating and debating on this issue almost since the beginning of mayoral control, I think this is the best chance that we have of making a real change, because there just seems to be a stronger consensus than ever before that the system has not worked over the last 20 years. Part of that, I think, is also that Mayor Adams has been particularly inept in bringing out his troops in a way that Mayor Bloomberg was very good at, with all his money, all the organizations he personally gave to, and the contracts that he gave to. He organized, separate organizations that were funded by Bill Gates and Eli Broad, and spent millions of dollars on advertising, et cetera, et cetera. And they had a much better organized campaign to keep mayoral control as it.
Leonie, you're
you muted. You went. Yeah.
Maybe I'm talking too much. Maybe you muted me. But anyway, after March 31st, I think we're going to see an opportunity of lots of groups reaching out and having parents and teachers reach out to their legislators to try to have an impact on this.
Okay, will that state report, will that be made public online? If you want to see it?
It should,
Okay.
it should be, yeah. Okay, I'm going to read a question that was submitted. Are you aware of any other school district governance structures beyond mayoral control and elected school board that have been tried? So for instance, have assemblies with delegates from schools or regions been attempted? Could it be that neither elected board nor mayoral control are democratic? Is this binary a dead end? And might we think more creatively about how to design a structure appropriate for the people of the city? Who would like to take that?
Well, one thing about that is that Chicago tried essentially kind of a parent-controlled school system that the Illinois Supreme Court at least determined wasn't representative enough of the general public. And so one thing I think that we do have to remember, it was a lot of, I think, very passionate and informed views in the hearings to have more teacher and parent control. The difficulty there is that question of education, public education being a public good, and everybody gets a vote, not just the knowledgeable, not just the people with kind of a vested interest as parents and educators, but it's in New York. We have a population full of people who don't have children, and our community members have an interest in the public schools, but not necessarily in the day-to-day running of the schools. And I worry actually about a wide open electorate, not necessarily being interested in teaching and learning, but in book banning and other cultural war issues.
Anyone else want to take that?
Yeah,
well, we had sorry, go ahead.
Well, just really quickly, we haven't seen a ton of variation in governance structures. To David's point, we saw Illinois and also in Chicago with the school council's decentralized school-based governance structure with still oversight from a school board. You saw that structure also in the state of Kentucky. They implemented that same model of school-based management that limited the central authority power, but there still was some central authority power And then you've seen more just like straight state takeovers of districts. I think Inglewood, California was one of the most like overt and strict state takeovers we've seen, where like they literally sent a superintendent from Sacramento to like run the district and manage it. And so, but that's been pretty much the scale. It's usually some form of like community-based hyper-local control, or it's very, very strict state power being superimposed.
Yeah, and I just want to just pick up on something that David mentioned before, is that I think we do have to reckon with the consequences of direct democracy and the fact that it can swing in a lot of unpredictable ways. And some of the most reactive and racist and isolationist practices have come from people using the term parent power, right? And so, you know, just because the loudest voices and the people with the most social capital and the most politically connected are able to mobilize and really have their say, it doesn't mean that that is going to be good for us and for the system.
Right, and to that point, someone submitted a question saying, I chair a community board committee. People think that by changing from mayoral control, we risk book banning and anti-LGBT. How do we respond to that? So, yeah, Heather.
Well, you know, I'm going to take an opposite position here. And I think, yes, there are risks to direct democracy for sure. And Mark, you talked about the need for, you know, the need to get people out, the need to get people engaged, the need to get people to vote, the need to get, and that, you know, when we're in a room and those voices are loud, the ones that are what you know, all the things that now that we're worried about, we had the same issues, similar issues, not the same. Back during decentralization, we had the Children of the Rainbow curriculum that brought out the Phyllis Schlafly organizers, and there was a, you know, group in Queens that were, you know, fighting against the rainbow curriculum, and we had a school board meeting. We had, you know, 50 cops at the meeting, and it actually, my late husband Norm Fruchter wrote about that, and I just read it again, and it was an amazing process. Actually, parents who believed, whose family members were gay, were against the curriculum and spoke about that at the meeting. But everyone spoke, and we established somehow an environment where everyone felt that they could speak and everyone could be heard. And, you know, we ended up with a decision where parents could opt out, right? If they didn't want their child to be reading the book or whatever. But it was actually it was an example for me of how you can actually, at a local level, try to have those conversations. And I'm not trying to say that that's always possible. I'm just saying that that's what direct democracy forces us to try to make happen.
I agree. I don't, and when I said what I said, I wasn't saying that. I mean, look, I'm an organizer. Clearly, I believe in democracy and in direct democracy. I just think we have to do with our eyes open and know that, and we just have to be in a position to counter some of those very destructive forces that are out there.
There's a woman named Laura Papano who's just written a book. I had her on my radio show. I really highly recommend it. It's called School Moms, Parent Activism, Partisan Politics in the Battle for Public Education. And she has a whole chapter over this school board in Queens that had a battle over book banning. And, you know, hundreds of people showed up and the cops came, and it was virulent and very, very, you know, almost violent. But, you know, the school board that banned the books got unelected the next time the elections ran away because parents were activated to how damaging that particular school board had been and voted them out of office. So yeah, there's no guarantee that any group of parents is ever, or any elected officials are ever going to be good leaders, but at least you have the chance then to vote them out. And with mayoral control, it's very, very difficult to vote them out on an issue like education. You know, it's just with Bloomberg, we had, you know, he overturned term limits, and so we had him for 12 years, and it was really pretty much a nightmare.
I do want to bring up a point that Nikwan raised earlier that goes with elected and participatory democracy, which is stability. I mean, the superintendency is probably the most insecure job in America. You know, 3 to 6 years, and can turn on just kind of the personal animus of a given board member. The way the elections go, the superintendents are fired, hired, fired again. And so a lot of the talk in the hearings was about the need for more stability. Certainly that's what, you know, we know our kids need stability. Teachers and principals need stability, almost more than they need like a good policy. They can work around a bad policy if given enough time, but just this back and forth. But and people think that there's more instability under mayoral control, but if you look historically, I did, and I think we had sort of we had vastly more chancellors under the 20 years before mayoral control than since mayoral control. I mean, say what you want about Joel Klein, he was there for a long time, 8 years. And so while we do change chancellors quite frequently, it is less true than in, I think, we would have an electoral system.
Okay. We're going to move to an audience question. It's probably going to be our last question. It's 8:55. So Olympia, you're going to probably have the last question.
Hi there. I had lowered my hand at a certain point because mine was one of the questions around why is this conversation being debated as a binary thing, either mayor or not mayor. And you asked it in some ways, but then you said other things, and I was like, actually, I should ask it. So I'm just a parent. I have no expertise, no historic context. I was not even raised in America, so I haven't been through the public school myself. But I do have 2 kids there, and I've experienced crazy absurdities. Like the principal doesn't know if they can hire you know, someone to help the kids reading during the pandemic because their budget is not approved until January and he needs to hire them in September, and crazy things like that, that to be honest, I think that, you know, a system where there is a combination, and sadly, I have served at a community board though, at the land use, so I know what community looks like, and I'm an organizer too on other issues myself. So I was thinking more of a system, you know, I don't know if you know the Scandinavian system, or where there is some expertise, like a civic servant that is stable and has some expertise that is paired with someone who is then elected, but then who's elected has to follow a constitution. We need to agree on a Bill of Rights of our students, right? And the constitution, like give them bylaws so they know they cannot book ban, they cannot shame LGBTQ or race or whatever. And so, I mean, is this a possibility? Am I because I'm ignorant on this issue, guys. But I do have 2 kids that I love a lot in this system, and so I'm trying to figure out how can we cut a little bit of the absurdities that we see every day in our schools.
Well, internationally, probably the most successful system is Finland, which has a great deal of school-based autonomy. And I'll leave it at that.
Finland has gone downhill recently in all the results. One reason is that they've instituted a lot of online learning and computers, and they have fallen into international competitions in recent years. So I think that there are sort of bills of rights of students in New York City and in the state. There are certain things that were not supposed to be allowed. But unfortunately, one of the problems is that a lot of the laws and rights that are embedded in those laws are not enforced. And so mayors have really been able to violate many, many laws over many, many years when it comes to student rights. So that's a problem that probably exists no matter what system of governance you have, but mayors in New York City have seemed to be able to get away with a lot. I think in Finland, one of the reasons that they succeeded for so long also is that teaching was a very highly respected occupation. The salaries are good, and they did two things at the same time. They lowered class size and they got rid of tracking. So the central government said to them, we want to get rid of tracking at the lower grades. And the teachers union said, okay, but you have to lower class size at the same time. And they did. And then they did the same thing at the middle school level and the high school level. And that means that not only are schools very equitable within schools, but they are equitable across the system. And they have no charter schools and practically no private schools. So everybody sends their kids to public schools, and all the schools are pretty much good across the entire country. And there was someone who's an expert on Finland who came and spoke at one of the events I was at when Bloomberg wanted to rate teachers by test scores. Okay. And he said, if you did that in Finland, all the teachers would walk out and they would not come back until you changed that system.
We are going to have to wrap up on that note because it is 9 p.m. So I want to thank our panelists so much for being here and for sharing your expertise. And I want to thank all of our guests for sticking with it. And I hope that you have learned a lot and feel inspired as you continue to think about mayoral control. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Bye.
Thank you, Amy.